So you who's going first? I'm not sure. I will.
He's like, we don't know.
Okay, cool.
We decided to do starts.
Which is good.
Yeah.
We'll find out in a minute.
Well, I'm trying to
We have no extension.
start me
We got
I'm
This is a big company.
There's no such thing as a
What? Yes.
There's no such thing.
You keep telling yourself that running.
Hello, easy boy.
Hey, why you curse me?
He's taking a piss or taking a selfie. At the same time.
Because you know so many Iranians.
I do actually look for one thing.
This is not a Kale gangster movie, but you sure.
Have you not seen the Chief Boss?
Hey, I just want you to please.
Baby. Show me. Show this to you. Show you.
Only good things can come from everything.
What?
Only good things.
I can do it actually. That one you can.
What is
I don't need.
something to live by?
If I guess about the
No.
You don't need another hurt him any way you can.
Yeah.
You like that too, man?
Okay, come.
That's all across the way now.
Yeah.
How many time? Yeah, sure.
On your hands, yeah. Oh, this big season. Hi everyone. I'm sorry for the long delay. I'm not very good. I think I can answer to start the meeting.
Mr. Speaker, we think that there is a problem when it comes to urban centers, by which we are talking about things like mega cities, for example, cities like London or cities like Mumbai. And we think that the problem is that there is a huge mismatch between the demand for residential property within these areas and the supply of them. We think that this results in concrete harms that we want to solve today. The model that we have for you is roughly along the lines of rent control boards, which are already boards that exist in multiple parts of the world, where you have a body that sets the maximum rent that can be taken from these residential properties. The intent is not to deprive all profit from the people who own these properties, but to cap the extent of profit that they can be made to what the board thinks is a reasonable amount of rent. We think that fundamentally it's important to appreciate that there is a very specific context of high demand when it comes to these urban centers. Because the nature of urban centers, and it's crucial to appreciate this, is that they are often the only gateways accessible to a lot of people to a world of opportunities. So we see, for example, because they are hubs of economic activities, when it comes to things like access to jobs and employment and education, a lot of people will choose to migrate to these urban areas from other areas of the country, right? And we think that that's something that will happen and is exceedingly happening today. However, we also understand that not all of these people who come to these places are able to afford the sort of accommodation that is available within these cities. Which is why, for example, we see that increasingly there has been a propensity for increasing amounts of slums and squatters to come up within these urban centers. Because people simply can't afford the sort of accommodation that exists, or there simply isn't enough accommodation to cater to their demands. We think that once you understand this, it's also important to understand that the nature of housing is peculiar, right? As a fundamental good, housing often has the ability to displace other fundamental goods from the judgments that people make. So for example, while we think that people will probably not stop eating so that they can pay the rent, we think that people might stop sending their children to better schools so that they can afford to pay the rent for these accommodations that they stay in. We think that it's very likely that there will be compromises made on base people who cannot afford the exorbitant rates that are being charged in many cases by these properties in urban centers. Why do they charge exorbitant rates? Because the idea of price inelasticity applies squarely to this debate. The fact that there is so much demand for the limited amount of property that exists within these areas means that owners can afford to rest back and increase the prices at their own sweet will so as to earn the maximum amount of profit that they can from these properties. And as a result, we think that there is a need to control the excess profit that is being made over here. But before I proceed further, I'll take you.
Why to develop the myth that megacities are the only possible place for you to live, to develop, and to learn? Rather, because now governments are so busy spending money, throwing crime in these areas, rather than trying to develop.
Overnight. Areas, we need people to stay within these rural areas. As long as better opportunities exist in these cities, people will make the decision to migrate to these areas. And we also think that there is fundamentally benefits to people migrating to areas where they can get better opportunities in life, better access to economic development, for example. And we don't think that's something we wanted to discourage, even as we are okay with the idea of developing alternative places. But why do we think that ensure to every to have a situation when that accommodation and hence live in places like slums? We think that if there is something that the state can do in order to prevent this situation, then it's perfectly legitimate for the state to improve the dignity and quality of life that these people live by providing them access to these places of accommodation. And this is where the question comes whether to take up the private property, which we concede is owned by private individuals in society, and do this. We think that it's perfectly legitimate for the state to utilize private property to achieve certain societal goods in certain circumstances. These are circumstances, for example, when we think that not doing so will lead to high amounts of wealth inequality, which, by the way, is also one of the reasons we already have taxation in status quo. We think that if there are harms that are actively being caused due to the desires of a few people to make maximum profit out of the properties that they privately own, that's another ground for the state to step in and curtail their ability to do so. Because fundamentally, we think that while we're not denying them the ability to make any profit at all, and by imposing a standard of reasonableness on them, we are achieving a much larger social benefit. But I'll take one from closing before I move on.
Is there an inherent benefit to these poorer people, I assume, living directly within these centers who often are very commercial in nature?
We think that there are benefits, and these benefits extend two ways. One is in terms of the people themselves, who, as we identified, often do not have access to the same amount of opportunities and services in the areas that they originally come from. But we also want to identify a second benefit, which we think is simply in terms of the economic development of the country or the particular area there. Because we think that states have often invested in creating these sort of megacities so as to encourage development and employment within those areas. But if it comes to a situation where some people do make a choice that they do not want to live in areas like slums and squatters and decide not to migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas. We think that it can also possibly lead to problems where we are not maximizing the ability to extract economic development out of these areas. And we think in that respect also it's important to encourage economic development within these. One final point that we think acts as a benefit on our side in this debate is the idea of there simply being more housing as a result of this move. Because right now, people can afford to sit back and make profit out of the few units that they have without having to invest money in building more units. Because they simply have such a high margin of profit that they're extracting from the units that they already own. We think that if you're going to reduce the margin of profit that they can earn, there's a stronger incentive acting upon them to invest in simply creating more housing options, which we think goes squarely in terms of addressing the original problem that we identified, which is one of correcting the imbalances where vast numbers of people are unable to afford the housing that they deserve in the cities. And for all these reasons, we think that this is a move that needs to pass.
Yes, your speech to continue debate at the start about the opposition side are not invited to the opposition.
I'm not gonna tell you.
You idiot. Guys, it's totally okay for the state to come in and curb private property and private interests and things like that, right? Yeah, we're not going to contend with that. What we're really going to contend with is this is really going to better the lives of if they really wanted to talk about the rural poor moving into urban areas and whether this will help them at all, right? And we're also going to talk about how we really think they missed the boat on this debate on who the people who really need this really are and why they can afford to pay the high rent. Three things I'm going to be talking about within my speech, substantives and rebuttals amalgamated. Firstly, who is this really debate? Will this really help the poor or the middle class within the country? Secondly, let's talk about how this really stymies development of the country in, how this basically is a symptom of a much bigger problem, demand, how basically their policy doesn't really do anything to solve supply problems. And thirdly, let's talk about how this stymies the overall development of the country. Yes, and it is the poor. Because they wanted to talk about the poor, and let's really see whether or not this really helps them, right? They wanted to build on the myth and the dream that moving to Shanghai or moving to Beijing or moving to New York will be the solution to every one of my problems. The problem with this myth is that it is exactly this false notion of suddenly being able to make it big in the big city that creates that kinds of slums. Because these people never had the skills, were never trained in the kinds of commercial districts. They sell off their family farm. They think they can suddenly make it big. When really what they did was what was really needed for them, where they could at least act out some reasonable existence back in the rural areas. Maybe they will have lost that shot at having a brighter future. We're fine with that so long as the government put in the money to solve education problems or the lack of education problems. We think their kids probably would have succeeded in the process. No thanks. We think that, the myth that they perpetuate only continually creates more harms, more slums within these areas. Also increases the crime rates of these megacities because people tend to be a lot poorer, a lot more desperate. That's why New York and London have such high crime rates, right? Because the rates of desperation of which they have, because they feel that their country and the dream that which they were sold has failed them. No, thank you. But we thought this it was really supposed to us. The people who just graduated from universities, who are probably young, without roots, didn't want it to be close to both the work and the clubbing districts. So we think that these people are not really for the government when it comes to rental of housing and things like that. Since you're young, you kind of take the train, even if it takes you an hour, you can probably live with a less of sleep. Maybe it's the people who wanted families that which the government should be tackling the problem for. We think they can perfectly afford to do this, right? So this debate was never really about the poor. No thanks. So let's talk about how this stymied development within, how this is a symptom of a much larger problem. Because Nielsen's entire point was that there is huge demand, but supply, because you can't afford the supply of it, therefore housing prices are driven up. Look, COVID, the amount here he didn't want to deal with was that there will still be not enough houses, there will still not be enough developments because clearly your city can only develop so much. No thanks. But here's what they missed out. What was worse on their side is that now that developers know that their profit margins are going to be slashed, they're going to be a lot less likely to want to develop new condominiums, new housing blocks that could have gone out as rental for people, but they didn't, now that the profit margin is going to be slashed, they're a lot less likely to do that. On their world, you're going to have a lot fewer available houses and private properties for the people to be able to rent. I'll take it closer.
Development forces people to be more in city areas or areas with job scarcity. And also the characteristic that third world governments are more likely to invest in infrastructures in urban areas. Why is it fair for you for governments to condemn the poor to live in rural areas with low quality infrastructure?
First and foremost, we regret this. We are very, very sorry. But if everybody tried to move to London, if everybody tried to move to New York, we think that New York, as it is right now, is starting to look a lot like the slums of other cities because your government can only cope with so many people moving in at once. And this is why we already think that if people had the incentive to stay within these rural areas, governments actually who want the vote of the people staying there will have more incentive to want to develop there rather than try to sell them that dream and then they then go over to the cities and get screwed over by the big city, right? We think that basically that optic that the big city is where it's there to be at. Look, the government is now trying to get you to go there. You go there and get your dreams slashed. That is what leads to slumification within these cities. That is what's leading to what South Korea is right now, with 50% of the population trying to migrate over to Seoul, right? And the government simply can't cope. We don't care. Your problem doesn't do anything for it. It makes it worse because there's a lot of less available housing. But let's talk about how this stymies development of the country in general, right? Look, we need to understand that the only reason why Beijing and Shanghai or New York or London ends up being the key contender for wealth in its city centers because everybody is migrating there. With the high tensions, with the high, that's why the government feels the need to call resources there. They're trying to spread it out within the rest of the country. You create, by that myth with this policy that it's totally okay, the government can now subsidize your housing or slash the prices of the housing for you to be able to go there. You send more people there and the governments end up being trapped in a vicious cycle of trying to only develop the one mega city and neglecting the rest of the country as a result, right? We think that doesn't happen. We think that in status quo as it is, look, okay, KL is the city center. We think Shah Alam, for instance, is generally being developed by private developers, seeing that there are a huge amount of people who maybe aren't migrating over and kind of have their own needs and wants as well, and is therefore being slowly developed in the process. Guys, the whole world is poor. People is a birth lottery, but there are also smarter and more sensible ways to go about trying to solve this birth lottery, rather than just try to move everybody over to one big city center to be taken care of, right? Because there are limits to what a government needs to be able to do. So their side needs to understand that when you stymie these kinds of private developments and private properties, which is precisely what keeps the burden off and eases the country political capital. The poorest, the private property, while we think that sometimes it maybe ought to be capped on certain areas, this policy only does far more harm than it does any sort of good for the people whatsoever. We go in opposition.
I can remember position now I like deputy prime minister.
Mr. Speaker, the fact that people have always migrated to states like New York City and London and choose and accept living in slums is indicator that people are going to move to big cities anyway. Whether or not that may exist or then because the status quo or flow of migration of people buying into the. We don't think you can physically stop them from coming in. We think people have already accepted the kinds of slums they live in. We don't think that changes. So a couple of rebuttals to make before I go into my argument about combating class warfare. The first one, she said this doesn't help poor people because it's a myth. And so it's mythological because people expect to come in to work big jobs, but they end up living in slums. That's like circular, right? The reason why they live in slums is because you don't give them enough housing to live dignified lifestyles that integrate with people. So that myth is perpetuated in status quo right now. But two, we think that at the end of the day, extremely high rent rates right now already don't stop people from coming in, like I told you. So that problem still exists on your side of the house. The debate here then becomes, why are you okay condemning people to live extremely undignified ways where they compromise on other basic goods like children's education, things like other public goods like proper housing, things like sanitation, in order for them to be able to get access to basic opportunities like better jobs to begin with. That was a burden they never established. But here's the last rebuttal on this one. She said, is this really a myth to begin with? Not really, because if you look at hubs like London, and we look at hubs like Shanghai, they do offer you the most amount of opportunities for things like work. They do offer you the best abilities for you to actually increase your skill sets. It's a very basic part of your socio-economic progression as a human being to move to cities where they do have the ability to provide for that. So we don't think it's a myth entirely. We do think it's very much realistic. Sit down. She came up here and said, solve bullshit. We told you that it can solve something. Problem right now is because private developers and homeowners have no incentive to invest into other infrastructure like greater or further amounts of housing because they're very okay manipulating or exploiting these huge amounts of price elasticity where they can charge exorbitant prices for the kinds of residential areas they have and make a large amounts of money. When you cap the price ceiling, you reduce the supernormal profits that they can earn from the limited amount of households. That means the only way they get market capture is to be able to build more houses in this area. That increases supply as well. But let's assume that doesn't exist. The benefits of our model are still there, right? We still think that you allow people to have quality education, quality jobs. You don't allow them to compromise on standards of living, things that Natalie was clearly unwilling to deal with. The third thing she said was, practically speaking, this is mutually exclusive because it doesn't equally develop other states as well when governments focus entirely on megacities. That's not true. Practically speaking, not everyone can live in New York. It's the first thing you came up here and say. That's the reason why there's clearly an incentive to also develop other cities and other areas. But we think that in the interim period, while it's not mutually exclusive, there's going to be a 10-year gap at the very least for any kinds of development to take place in other states. The plugging in this gap is important for us to actually reduce the kinds of price ceilings that exist. That's why we say it's important for us to do so. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
Yeah, sure. Do you think individuals who can't afford these houses or get these jobs have a right to demand from the state and other people who can't decide these positions for these jobs or for these houses?
You see, I think opening came up here and said that's not something we're going to contest. We're okay with using private property for state means. Closing opposition has come up here and said that's not true. We always place burdens, and we always place burdens on rich people. We think that capacity to provide, we do then manipulate. When we have things like progressive taxes, we do allow the redistribution of wealth because we think that wealth accumulated in a certain degree of society cannot hold the progress of other people hostage just because of the seclusion of wealth among one community or one hierarchy of individuals. So yes, we do agree that the state can forcibly reduce the profit that they can make. We also think that states should be able to cater to people's demand for jobs and equal access to opportunities by granting them a more even playing field of entry to begin with. That's a perfectly reasonable establishment to make. Sit down. We think, okay, the argument here is, I'm going to provide is very simple. This combats class warfare. It's very important, especially in countries like Mexico City or countries like India, where you have a huge amounts of disproportionate kinds of policies passed, especially on a state level and a federal level. We think this is important because poor people's immobility is largely due to the fact that rich people do hold their socio-economic progress hostage by the seclusion of the kinds of wealth they keep among themselves. That means less jobs, less amounts of opportunities for people because it's largely concentrated where rich people live in rich cities and therefore don't provide these opportunities for poor people as well. That means that income inequality is very very high, and distribution of wealth and like resources of growth is really unequal when it comes to poor people and rich people. So the two actual implications of this policy. The first one is that it really creates a huge amount of friction when it comes to actual interaction between rich people and poor people. But the most insidious harm here is the kinds of actual policies actually like a parliament or campaign on grounds that allow for huge things like agricultural subsidies, taxes, things which are very class warfare based to very much benefit just fringe states and poor people alone without looking at long-term economic objectives. What changes when we do this? We say when you have the mobility or like people and labor into city states, what you then have is a more even distribution of people who end up living in these states, which means you get better outlooks on economic policies, you have better interaction to begin with. But the other benefits here are also simple. The fact that you can have a transfer of wealth from people who live and work in cities back to rural villages and rural areas also help development of these like fringe states and also allow them to make more economically informed choices. So all in all, we think this reduces the kinds of insidious campaigning that happens or insidious policies that are passed, which are very much directed at just proportionally helping a very certain ethnic group. It allows for a more equitable policies to be passed in terms of economic decisions when you allow people to work in city states and realize the economic climates and situations there. You also allow for the migration of wealth back to village states, which is something that is important for the development of rural states as well. And that's a benefit they also have to contest it. The fact that our model allows for greater migration of wealth also contributes to the development of other fringe states, we think is important, and therefore there is something they need to deal with. All in all, what have we established so far? We've established to you principally that when uncontested by open opposition, the state has a right to force people to cap their profits if it means greater goods for society. We told you that housing is a very important gateway for the fulfillment of your actual rights when you're moving up the social economic progress of things like getting higher education, better jobs, better servicing. We also told you that this is important to maintain the dignified standards of living. And lastly, we told you it's important when these people can send their wealth back to these areas and therefore create better economy. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Diego, and open house. I'd like to invite Diego.
Yes, come playing catch. There's a false paradigm presented in this case. They want to argue to us, like they want to tell us, like, oh no, we're not talking about the poor only, we're talking also about the middle class. But all of their argumentation focuses on the slums and how those people suffer and the opportunities that those people leave in the worst conditions that we somehow force them to live under in our model. But a certain number of people are going to move anyway. However, we lessen the number under our model because of the prices, like we allow the market forces to dictate the prices there. So let's talk about these opportunities that they say people are actually missing out on. First, they want to tell us that it harms access to jobs, education, and opportunity, and other opportunities. Education does not consist only in city centers. We know that because there are universities that exist actually in the suburb areas outside of the city centers, like NTU, for example, that lives outside of the main area of Singapore where it's not as expensive. So like students get student loans from the government, for example, to be able to live there, to be able to subsidize housing, for example. So we don't see those type of educational options. Even if you want to talk about like primary school and high school, public education, guys, is free. So we don't think that's necessarily decisions that they make all the time. They're going to decide, is it worth living in the city to be able to work there, or am I going to buy a house in Shah Alam or somewhere out in the suburb and commute every day? Or I can work somewhere else in Shah Alam as well, because contrary to what they want, the only job opportunities do not only exist in KL, they also exist in a whole bunch of other city centers that may be smaller, but also have job opportunities. But because people consistently feel that, oh, KL, the city center is like action is happening, nobody wants to go to these other places that have burgeoning job opportunities and profit-making potential. So at the point when you put a red cap here, this is when people will feel like, oh, I can still come there and still live, but there's problems there with plan that you did not want to analyze. Have a seat. So we see that necessarily this isn't necessarily a big problem. If you want to talk about the slums, for example, look, we also want to reduce slums as well. But A, that's reduced when you don't have as much people to come in, when it's not like cheaper for them, because the poor are never going to be able to pay the rent anyways. Because as long as you pay, the coming into the slums aren't going to be able to rent anyways. They're living in public housing. So like, they are never going to be part of this debate. Those people that live in those abject worst conditions that you guys want to focus on, have a seat. So we're talking about the middle class, people who have jobs, can afford the higher rent, but yes, we'll have to make cost-benefit analysis that people make on a day-to-day basis. But I'll tell you later on why tackling this type of inequality is not going to be beneficial in the long run. So let's talk about their analysis on like what actually happened with prices now, right? Because they want to focus on the demand side and how they came like less by low. I want to read that is so they're not so they don't want to build right now because they see that there's a million and not enough supply. That's the problem that exists in prices. That's the problem that you guys will create. But under our model, what we do, when we let prices go up, this is when we allow like for the construction of more units. Because what you didn't want to concede under your side is when you cap the price, that means you limit the amount of profit making potential that developers and homeowners can actually make. There's less incentive for them to create. They can't make it to recoup the time we want to talk about from the corporations that and the development cost. This property government, the development is therefore able in development agricultural. So you in the long run, when you limit the amount of profit for them, have a seat, guys. Set the amount of profit, they'll still be able to make profit, but you don't know everyone's cost. The cost that is on a development that's massive is not the same cost as on a single homeowner that wants to rent out his place when he's not staying there over the summer. Fees of rental, drawing up documents and lawyer fees may not be worth it there. So therefore you have less units being sold on the market on that sense as well, meaning there's less opportunity for the middle class and the people who are talking about this debate to actually access the type of benefits that you want to talk about as well. Let's talk about the inequality that all have a seat. Let's talk about the inequality, something that they said will definitely increase on our side. Look, inequality is going to exist under both models, of course under ours, but here's the thing. At a certain point, tackling inequality, like we're going to propose a radical idea that at a certain point, tackling you have a diminishing returns that you get from it. Because tackling it comes at the expense of economic happen absent doing those things. So we don't necessarily
people only do so on other basic things. Why is it fair to allow this expropriation to continue?
Here's the thing. We told you how people make these type of cost-benefit decisions anyways, right? So we told you education is not a concern here. But even if they pay for like a less like comprehensive form of healthcare, they made when they decided to live in KL rather than live in Shah Alam, where maybe healthcare was a little bit cheaper because there isn't a lot of demand there. And they brought in her debate that you guys never wanted to engage with, when she told you that you take away any incentive from the government and private corporations to go and continue developing there, because no one's moving to those areas when you continue this myth and like keep the prices so low that people want to come into KL, but there's not going to be enough units for them, so you still have all those problems in the long run. So what happens therefore is that no continued development does not happen there. So this 10-year gap they want to talk to us about, like, oh, but fine, the problem still exists now, what are they going to do those 10 years? Guys, other places do currently exist that have profit potential, that do have job opportunities, but they will develop a lot slower and moving their policy that limits the prices in KL such that people want to move there instead of further areas of growth and expanding and spreading the development to other areas that could benefit from that, thereby increasing the economic development of the country. At the end of the day, this debate is about how do we best improve opportunities for the middle class as a whole in the whole country, and not just in the city centers, and this is not necessarily about the slums. If you want to have the tax base necessary to be able to develop the rest of the country in the equitable way that you guys want to talk about, so that we don't have people from the slums coming to the city, this is what you allow the free market to dictate prices. People will make those cost-benefit decisions, but now they will make it in favor of allowing government incentives and private incentives to continue development in other rural areas and other areas that are already somewhat developed, but will only develop more when people are there and attract more companies to develop those areas further. We are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Opposition. Now to start the closing answer, I think, right.
Mr. Speaker, the fundamental problem from the opening opposition is that they didn't want to accept the very real situation that was provided by our opening, where they told you that poor people, the lower middle income, are already there in cities, that they're already struggling. Some of them have lost their homes, lost their mortgages, and remain homeless in these places, and slums really do exist. That was the reality that they didn't want to engage with, and they never told us how they could better help the poor by either making cities safer or more functioning, or how they would reduce rates of crime, how they would keep up that development in these cities. They never told you how they would better the livelihood of the poor. All their analysis was just to say that eventually, as the economy and the cities develop, that prices would go down and that it would be accessible. But the problem exists today, and we have to deal with it now. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you, and that will come from closing government will be how do we improve the lives of the poor, and I'll give you 3 reasons for this. First, how we incentivize politicians to help the poor by not allowing them to sweep the problem on the rug. Secondly, how we gain empathy from the higher class and elite classes and how they are the prime movers of political capital. Thirdly, how trickle-down economics works better when you have rich and poor living side by side. Before that, 4 rebuttals. First, they told you there are higher crime rates when we move poor people into cities when they're not ready to. The reason for that this exists in places like London, for example, is that most salaries and household incomes primarily go to rent. That means these poor or these lower income have less purchasing power sets to put into things that will either turn them away from the life of crime. They have less money to put into healthcare or education, or money to get an abortion or contraception, which they end up having more kids in, they end up being more poor. They have to take 2 of them to monitor them to make sure that ladies and gentlemen, which makes crime a more financially pragmatic solution, and gangs are better providers than the state is. So if we reduce the rent and we give them more purchasing power, they have less reason to commit crimes or to rob banks or to rob grocery stores. Purchasing power means less crime. That was a given. First, although we agree that there are less profits to develop, it doesn't remove the profit motive or substantially alters the behavior of these companies. Because the overall, the overall market profits of developing property is substantially more than the slight reduction due to rent ceilings. So if in New York, for example, a rent of $1,000 is reduced to $700, the profit you make from having the $700 in the first place is substantially more, and have gentrification, as well as foreign businessmen from Hong Kong, China, and Singapore, thanks guys, end up buying these properties and leaving them vacant in order to artificially drive up prices, because they artificially create that demand. That means that, you know, prices of a lot of properties in London, for example, and Chelsea, go skyrocketing because necessarily people buy them up, hoard up properties in order to cause the market prices to go up. If you put rent ceilings, they can't do this because essentially the price is controlled and the state sets a limit for how much demand or how much supply and controls that market force. Thirdly, they told you, well, hang on, people can commute into cities, they can live outside community cities. Yes, but the poor and the lower middle income can't afford to even, like, you know, integrate into cities. So even if they cross the Brooklyn Bridge to work in Brooklyn, they can't go around the store and go to the Tesco's there because price, which means more poor people in these areas, grocery stores, banks, and all these places would have to drive down prices because necessarily they have to cater to the larger market demand. It makes cities more accessible for everyone. Lastly, they told you there'll be a huge concentration of labor and human resource in cities, not enough in other places. Well, this happens anyway, right? If there's an industrial or an innovative explosion in cities, people will move there, right? London and New York are financial capitals, like Manchester and Pittsburgh are like, people will move there when the innovation exists. But the danger, ladies and gentlemen, is the concentration of purely elite class individuals or the rich, which I'll talk to you about right now. First, how do we best improve the lives of the poor? On the first level, we force politicians to help the poor. Currently, there's very little to no incentive for politicians to help the poor, either to make cities more livable or to develop rural areas. Because A, revenues primarily come from cities, and they're the main indicator of development. So a lot of governments put money into cities to make lots of money and then say, hey, we're making lots of money, but it's really just a facade. Secondly, tourists mostly just go to cities. So they move homeless people out. They get rid of soup kitchens, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, in order to create this facade of development. If you have a rent ceiling now in places like Kuala Lumpur, that means more poor people move in. That means that the government now has less ability to deny that they're doing anything about this, which means they have more incentive to develop and make cities more affordable, give these people a good livelihood so they don't turn to crime, or they have to develop rural areas to stem the inflow of poor people into cities. So they have to take responsibility. But at the moment, they can essentially bank on the development of cities and say, we're making good GDP, whereas that GDP is highly concentrated into cities. We change that calculus. Before I move on, yes?
So you can have it both ways. Either you're going to lower the rent enough such that companies will naturally be somewhat disincentivized to pay more things, or you're not producing any benefits whatsoever because you're not lowering the rent enough. You can't have it both ways.
No, we're talking about the behavior of companies developing and people buying properties are different things. Right, so although we admit, like maybe some property developers will be put off by this, but a majority of them, especially because property is scarce, they want to build these houses then in the first place, because if they don't build it in the next 10, 20 years, someone else is going to build it. And building it now and having a rent ceiling is substantially better because essentially you own that property and you own that market share. Second point, getting empathy from the high class. Right now, because a lot of cities, especially in developing countries like KL and London, for example, there's a great sense of otherism of the poor because the elite classes hoard up a lot of these, high rent properties. They don't mix around the poor. They're not normalized. Therefore, they do not empathize. And this is important because the rich usually contribute more to political parties. The rich in discourse on Facebook and Twitter, they're the ones who donate to political parties and lobby for change in Congress. And the poor can't do this because they just don't have money to do so. If the poor starts living side by side with the rich, and the rich now realize that they have to do something to make sure that their neighbors don't commit crimes or don't have crappy livelihoods, it's more likely that they're going to change policies and push politicians to change these policies. Lastly, on trickle-down economics, right? We understand that a lot of poor people money or contribute time to PTA meetings in schools. But if you take a poor kid and a rich kid and put them in the same school, the poor kid benefits from the efforts and the commitment. So when a rich parent goes to PTA meetings, contributes time and all these things, the poor children around benefit this. This to ensure equitable distribution of wealth as well as development. We're happy to propose.
We are switching the speaker order. We're switching the speaker order.
Yes.
Yes. Because we will know extension, and I can't have extension first. So.
Is that the running next one?
This is secret medium, so you can't do it more.
Your last one I just called.
Okay. The question of rent ceiling, will more poor people move in? To some degree, Kana is right. It's probably really can't solve, and probably they will always try to get in. But the rejection of this is really one, that he should be so flippant to say that this is an inevitable thing and we can't do anything about it, and therefore we should accept it as a given and try to make their life there better. And second, in Rafik, that this means that more people will move in because there's a better seating. But that doesn't solve the problem, because the true problem in this question, or this debate, is really, can they actually afford the new houses that you're presumably building to the extent that you can solve problems that you yourself created, which is a big missing gap in this case. My extension is going to be what the debate should have been about, and what it should therefore be. First, is this policy right in principle? And second, is this smart and smart states have to allocate the land in a proper way functions for the entire state? You want to question whether or not in the consideration of land outside the city centre, which is the keen focus of opening government and opening government, or closing government, where you don't seem to think that there are different kinds of land outside the city centre, is this a wise allocation? Is there ways which we can fractionalize for everyone in a community society? First, is this right in principle? Yeah, sure.
Do you believe that there are a lot more Democrats or elite class Democrats in New York and Texas, because New York, because of red state, you have more poor people around them?
I agree that we don't want to defend principal points because we agree that the state but because what I'm going to tell you is that what she meant with this is that the question of whether or not an individual has the ability to do something, whether or not a state has something to do, has right to do this, is a very different question from whether or not they should do it and do it, takes into consideration whether or not it's principally right or wrong. And that clearly must be what that means, to the extent by saying that certain individuals should be able to say, or in certain considerations, understanding that principal considerations are hindrance to states doing these things means that they shouldn't do it in the first place. It's a very different question of whether or not coming out with this particular point. First, we think that on the cost-benefit analysis of whether it's principally right, which seems to be the thing that they're doing here, we are happy to favor the rich and the people who are already in these positions. Second, we don't think it's right for anyone to be small. We think that as a whole, we think they're much better, or we don't think the state or anyone in particular, any social group, is trying to blackmail others. But first of all, see, the problem with the entire case is really this. Even if I accepted that everything O has said about how that like people not want to create like these particular houses or whatever, the benefit that people who are currently living in slums will get houses. Because the problem with the fundamental case is that you're still using a price bidding system without changing the actors who are bidding for these things in the first place. You don't change the dynamics of the characters individuals within the bidding process, which means that the people who are currently don't have the ability to fight against the bidders who often win aren't changed in your policy. You are merely increasing the supply, however, not changing the current ability of people to buy more things. And the problem with this is that you've already accepted that it's a supply side problem, meaning to say, even if you increase the kind amount of houses there are, this will only serve to allocate to the people who currently can afford these, but can't because there aren't houses to begin with. And what Hassan said was actually right, but didn't say in his speech, in the POI, but now let's explain it in clarity, which is this. That you can't have both the idea that I am not going to take profit from individuals, right? But I'm going to cap it at a level that poor people can afford these houses. That is the problem. No, thank you. Even if I assume, no, thank you, there's some equitable rate to which you can price it, the last people who are able to afford houses will be the people in the slums, middle income people, every other slum dwellers in the first place. That is the problem that you don't solve. But let me tell you why our option is better with property. First of all, let's go through the ideas. So we don't think, first of all, that inequality is an inherent bad in and of itself. It should not be a debate-winning argument to just say inequality happens, it's bad for poor people, therefore I win because I can say more here than the other side. Oops, sorry. Anyway, the point is really this. To the extent that there are different metrics to be used to determine principal rights and wrongs, meaning that one metric that we're using consistently is whether or not the cost-benefit analysis is good or bad. Let's take that cost-benefit analysis. To the extent we look at city centers, the kind of jobs that happen in these places often are not the types of jobs that some people might often qualify to begin with. Often the types of middle to lower income people are within the production lines or other types of jobs that require or suit the types of qualifications even better. Which means, ironically, there are a lot of the types that be traveling out of city centers to go to these jobs in the first place. Even if they didn't, we give you the radical proposal that only a few of them will qualify the jobs within city centers in the first place. Which means your allocated benefit coming out of opening government and closing government doesn't seem to fit the model of first, the types of industries and the kinds of employment ratios within these capital centers in the first place, and also doesn't fit the kinds of characterizations you made about urban city centers to begin with, since most of these particular jobs that they presumably, if they were able to get, are out of city centers to start with based on your definition. No thanks.
But second, we also don't think on the comparative that we should sacrifice the ability of rich people to buy these houses, assuming, in your case, that slum dwellers get all these houses in the first place. To the extent the capital-intensive industries are all within these city centers, we're happy to say that in terms of allocating efficiency, it is much better that the haves, the people who are rich, are able to get to work faster to the extent that enables these economies to be more flourish and have the most productive access to these spaces, be able to be productive to the extent that it helps people as a whole. No thanks. But second, let's talk about whether or not this is a good allocated policy. And let's remove this whole veil. There are certain things that are out of bounds that we can't do because debates and rhetoric tell us we can't. The reality is that the best cities Mumbai, as well as Beijing, fall from fractionalism of land in the consideration of all other lands we can use. The Hutong system that disqualifies people for entering policies of being able to access particular types of houses based on class privilege and the names that they have is an incredibly controversial system, but it's a centerpiece why many urban planners and many urban institutes of academics have considered Beijing's housing policy to be amazing, because that is how they drove poverty, it drove all the negative things about that affected commercial industries in Beijing out of these spaces in the first place, and remarkably improved their lives as well, even though on the basis that they understood there are different kinds of lands that are much suited for different kinds of industries and processes to begin with. To that extent, we think there are certain areas that are much better suited for housing, and those areas, to the extent that they often are near commercial routes like Manchester, like Rafi was talking about, are considered as fundamentally unsuited to these housing processes in the first place. That is why they don't exist there. The reason why people go there is not because they want housing, because they have a false illusion that they can get jobs. And this false illusion will continue independent of whether or not housing exists, because they don't have the qualities to get these particular things. Therefore, a policy that affects housing doesn't solve the other problems that you deem would lead to benefits in your case. Last of all, we also think that once you are able to enable governments and state planners to be able to see that there's outside move the kinds of solutions that both the government teams have participate, that we must solve all problems within urban centers, you need to understand that other lands with better something about people.
Mr. Chair, this debate is not solely about mass migration to the cities, but this debate will also encompasses to allow them to prices with that. Let's look at this debate we want to. We have an opening opposition who saw Elysium and decided to side with the villains, and we have a closing opposition who wanted to play the price as right. Three questions in this debate. The first question would be, is that will the poor be able to afford these houses? Second of all, is it fair to have this, the rich to be exclusively for the rich? And thirdly, I'm going to talk about in general who's better political empathy. Right. So the first level of this debate is that will these poor are able to afford these houses? According to closing opposition, they said that now the bidders would somehow, now a lot more bidders would somehow bid the maximum price, and people would actually not be able to buy these houses. Here's the thing: at least there will be a limit where exactly this bidding goes. So somehow, if you have categories of areas for people with lower income, now these people are forced to actually sell them or rent it out to people of the lower income group, because you can't get somebody who have more income to actually buy the houses there. Second of all, is that prices are more likely to go down when people realize that they can't bid for the houses in this general. So when they realize that they can only cater to people of the lower income, that is when they don't expect an upfront price that is ridiculous, but people are more willing to accept upfront prices. They are a bit more lower because that is the only group that you target in general. Sit down, everyone. Thirdly, you have categories on which type of flats or housings are for certain areas. Let's say, for example, you have condominiums are targeted for the rich areas, so the boards would work different levels or different categories for it. But the problem here is that when it comes to cheap apartments, rich businessmen assume that they can jack up the prices in general and somehow rent it out to people who are not yet catered to. So it becomes even worse when it comes to government policies, because when government somehow give out subsidies for developers to build houses, it goes to waste, because at the end of the day, only the people who are in the middle class and not the lower income are able to actually get these houses. So whatever government subsidies that exist, it does not actually work in any form. We at least allow people to make the subsidies targeted to the right people. First question done. CG is out of this debate. Before we move on to the second argument, yes, go.
So if I'm a rich person, why don't I go to a high city area and buy a city area?
No, mainly because at least now when you do bidding, it is limited to what certain amount you can do so, and those amounts are targeted to the poor in general. Not to mention is that when you are already a rich person and buy these houses, you are less likely to give a high rent because you have more people who are moving in are able to get into the houses, and you are more likely to accept a lower upfront price. Just the second argument, is it fair to have the city as an elite zone? We say it's unfair. Why so? Because firstly, is that most of the time governments invest in these urban areas, and the fact that jobs are there is not an illusion, and not an illusion most of the time. It's unfair for them to push this characterization. Why so? Because these are the places where most businesses are. So for example, when McKinsey wants to invest in a certain country, the first place they target to would be the capital city. And that is where they would prioritize where their money goes to. And because you want these foreign companies to be there, that's why you build stuff like Cyberjaya or MCMC, where they provide the best fiber optic cables within that region, or the best amenities for these foreign companies, because you want to attract them and put them on there, and you can't spread out the argument about satellite cities. It's contingent on the fact that governments have unlimited number of resources. When you talk about governments like Indonesia, they can only focus to capitals like Jakarta. That is why jobs are somehow within that area. Even if the debate is about the middle class in general, you force these people to move in suburbs, and somehow they have to commute very far. Rafiq's mom has to live in Seremban and move to the middle of KL and spend a lot of money every day when it comes to fuel. When in fact, Rafiq can be sent to probably Oxford instead, because he has more money to spend in comparison to a better university instead. I agree, Yutimara isn't that great when it comes to peace. But second of all, is that when it comes to amenities, you have to understand that everyone should have the equal opportunity to get into the best schools. What happens here is that they condemn the poor to forever be in a cycle of horrible education or horrible healthcare systems. Why so? Because the richer groups, like what Rafiq explained earlier on, will always have the political lobby, and they are the ones who are able to get the MOE to put good teachers in the better districts, or even have more money to fork out when it comes to something they didn't tackle on. It's rich businessmen economics, and somehow they are able to integrate within the poor within the area, and then the donation actually receives the best impact in comparison. The rich who extra effort to go to the rural, look at the children poor and trickle down gets down. All right, here's the third question: who gives greater political capital to the poor? There's something general opposition that's the whole opposition spoke about. First is that now that when you go outside with areas, now somehow they're able to have in rural areas, their voices are even muddled out even more, because the rich people who live there are much more isolated to the poor. That means they live in estates. That means they don't integrate with the poor in the general, and they fight for their policies. So what is assumed most of the time is that when it comes to policies within rural areas, these people are prioritized in the first place. That means I need to tackle your probably the big businesses within Texas, or within Texas in comparison to big businesses, the education system within the schools. So you are less likely to have political empathy. What should we allow political empathy in our proposal? And this is exclusive from closing. When you integrate with the poor and you constantly see see that they live within the same area, you tend to know more about the situation in comparison. United, huge concentration of Democrats in New York because they understand and are more willing to fight for the poor because they live side by side. Mayor Giuliani did a great job for the poor New York, people of New York, and we want to cite her on this issue.
Okay. Hey, where's your timer? So the thing that they never really quite wanted to accept was that the very people they're talking about, the poor people that live in the slums, are somehow disconnected from the actual benefits of the policy that they are talking about. So today we're going to talk to you about two things. Firstly, we'll deal about whether or not there's actually a problem and who actually, like, whether or not the benefits they're talking about will actually materialize in that sense. But secondly, we're going to bring back all the analysis that Brian gave to you in Closing Government about why exactly we think that it's good for states to actually, like, forcibly ensure that these states do, these urban centers do maintain themselves as commercial areas for the good of the rest of the country. So let's talk about the first question. Is there really a problem and do people really benefit? Let's just deal with everything that Kana said, right? Because they gave us a lot of rhetoric in opening government about how the very this is a very, very sad thing. Here's the thing, right? These very poor people are not going to be able to afford the houses you're talking about in any case, in either side, right? Because on the other side, even if you do have rent ceilings, the problem is these rent ceilings are going to be high enough that these very poor people still don't stand to benefit. So those are not people that are going to have a dignified standard of living in any sense of the word, even on your side. No, thank you, sir. But what actually happens here? We think that on their case, when you have rent ceilings, you need to understand one very simple reality, which is this: these places, these urban centers, have a supply problem. That means that there's always going to be an excess in demand, and people will always have to fight for the houses that are involved. What happens then? We think that in the best case scenario that they can talk about, what happens in the lottery system, right, where the rich and the poor both have to bid together for the same houses like that everyone else wants to have. Here's the issue, right? Here's something that Brian talked about, no thank you, sir, that they never quite dealt with, which is that even in these cases, even in the best case scenario that both of them have an equal opportunity, the number of people who actually benefit in terms of like the middle class that do get these houses is vanishingly small. But secondly, we think that it's always going to be stacked in the side of the people who are already rich anyway, for the simple reason that in these urban centers there is some standard of like living that the governments want to promote in these commercial centers. Behind that, no, thank you, sir, you have things like, for example, rent requirements, right, where you have to have some sort of upkeep of the houses that you are talking about. The problem is poor people are very badly suited to be able to upkeep on these rent issues anyway, so they're going to end up losing their houses in that sense. We don't wanted to come out with, right? Because essentially what they told us is, look, there's going to be gentrification, and it's very good for poor people now, because the more poor people there are in these urban centers, the more incentivized these people are to help them. That's just untrue, right? One, what happens is that when more and more poor people move into these areas, all the benefits you're talking about in terms of better housing just don't materialize, because now that there are more people, no thank you, sir, we think that you max out the infrastructure and all the benefits you're talking about. So that means when these individuals, these middle class individuals, stay in the places where they previously lived in, they could potentially be accessing, no thank you, sir, like somewhat equitable or somewhat similar standards of schooling, or no thank you, sir, whatever else that other benefits, because they really only talk about schools, like somewhat similar standard of schooling. And if they move to the city center, there might be some sort of marginal increase, but the marginal increase is very much diminished by the fact that these infrastructures are now maxed out by the kind of demand that you artificially create in these places closing.
Given that city centers are the main focus of not just politicians but also the rich, who have all political capital to change policies, isn't having the poor people there even better, so that they can actually probably
let's just think about what happens to these places, no thank you, sir, when like all these poor people move into like the rich people's area, right? Because what happens now is that you artificially like depress the A standard of living that these rich people have, but B also the property prices that these rich people can create goodwill for the poor people that move in. They're just going to create a massive amount of resentment. No, thank you, sir. The massive amount of resentment that only make these rich people less likely to want to help the poor people to begin with, right? And furthermore, and here's where we move on to the second clash of today, right? It's precisely that political pressure. No, it's precisely that political pressure. You know what? Just make it fun. I'm not going to get any for opening. It moves on to the second point of
in what should the state do. Because it's precisely that political pressure that closing keeps talking about that we don't want to have. And here's where all the analysis that Brian gave you went massively unrebutted, right? So here are a few reasons why we say it's good for the rich. On a very superficial level, we think it's excessively good that rich people live in urban centers because these urban centers were created to support the very kinds of industries that rich people flourish in, and it's good for them to be close to their houses. Like all these middle class and poor people, generally speaking, do not work in these urban centers and don't need the houses there. They can get jobs in other areas in other parts of the country as well. But secondly, let's make the comparative for you, right? Rather than actually forcing these individuals, go sit down, all of you, rather than forcing these individuals or telling these individuals that they have to move into urban centers and try to artificially lower prices in order to allow them to get in. We think that it's far easier for government to simply invest in things like better transportation, for instance, to make it easier for these individuals to commute to their workplaces. So the comparative is this, right? We think it's far simpler for these individuals to just take that transport or commute over to the main city center in order to get to the job they're talking about, if they really have to do that, than for you to make them or tell them that they somehow need to get a house in these areas and do all the upkeeping that they're not actually equipped to do. Fine.
Okay. Besides, people told you to still have more options under our model. We told you people living in residential areas who now have more affordable income to spend on other public goods like children's education and be able to migrate their wealth back to the villages and also have better economic.
It's very simple, right? If you don't have the money to live in an urban center, don't live in an urban center. Live somewhere that's and take the train to work. That's just the cost benefit analysis that you have to do, right? And we're perfectly fine with governments, like what Brian told you in the example of China, creating areas around the city center and around these commercial areas where people can easily get to work, if they do work there, and more affordable housing there as well, rather than putting in these things that artificially increase demand for houses in these commercial areas. That's just precisely what we're talking about. So how does this actually benefit the economy that we're talking about, right? A, these individuals are just more efficient, right? Because they are more able to get to their work. But two, these people actually have the right to these houses as well. But thirdly, we think that it's good for them because we think there's a reason why we ensure that commercial areas are just commercial areas, right? One, it increases the efficiency of the way that these that these industries are able to carry out their workplace as well. It also ensures that things like, for example, violent crime, for instance, don't happen, that disrupt the functioning of these capital hubs as well, right? And what we think that we should do, rather than artificially increasing demand in these places by lowering the rent and things like that, is instead government should reprioritize the way that they spend their money to ensure that systems like the hukou system, where you are allotted housing around the city center based on your need for it, are implemented instead. We think it's a far more efficient outcome that benefits everyone involved. So at the end of today's debate, we told you there's no problems. Please approve.